out of the spare bedroom in Marcia's house where she could work all day and night in her pajamas. She navigated and won the allegiance of book groups, local bookstores, writers groups, always honoring geographic differences, multiple genres, and reckoning with territoriality and artistic quirks. But what she did most was make writers feel welcome and honor them at whatever stage in their development of craft. That was key. She firmly secured the ethos of hospitality and fun that characterizes the network today. But the one thing I worried about, the one time we kind of came to a little bit of disagreement, was that Marcia was working so hard she could never be replaced. We never paid her enough, but in hindsight, I realized that the care and feeding of a first grader is very different from that of a full-grown being, which is what she nurtured and what the network has become. Now we have our routines. We're pretty mature. Case in point, we're here today honoring the newest among the 60-plus inductees already in the North Carolina Literary Hall of Fame, which Marcia and the network also helped establish with her dear friend Sam Reagan and the North Carolina legislature. I remember an afternoon up in the library that's now the Hall of Fame with Sam and Marcia, Sam's hat on the table, and he was telling stories of Carl Sandburg and when Carl Sandburg came to visit here. It was heady stuff for me. So we know what to do now. We've been taught well. We had a sterling mentor. So friends, let us now praise and thank Marcia Warren for all she has given us. I used to be 5'2". Marty, can you see?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, I'm so glad you're here. I gotta put my glasses on. Thank you very much, Georgina. I'd like to begin by saying that if everyone who should be up here with me today were here with me, they wouldn't fit on this little platform. I'm the member of a team, and I'd like to tell you just a few of the many teammates from those early formative years of the network. But before I do that, I'd like to tell you how I got to know them. So I get to tell you about the Red Baron restaurant in Carrboro, North Carolina. After my mother died in 1977, I was inconsolable. And for some unknown reason, as I had not been a writer before, I began writing. I began writing sad poems. Not about her, I couldn't do that yet. I wrote a poem about Beatrix Potter's lonely little life in the top floor of her nursery in her home while her parents went about their fancy London lives, and how she got her butler, Cox, to bring her a mouse from the pantry so she could play with him and draw him. And I wrote a poem about a young Edward Albee whose dream it was to be a poet, got up the courage to take his poetry to W.H. Auden. The famous poet responded to Albee's poems by tossing them one by one into the river as they sat drinking coffee. Edward Albee told us that story himself. I wasn't very cheerful in those days. Then 6 months after Mother died, I saw a tiny announcement in the Chapel Hill Weekly. Lois Holt put it in there. Where are you, Lois? Lois put it in there. And it said that the Friday Noon Poets would be meeting as usual at the Red Baron restaurant in Carrboro, and all you had to do was come and bring something to read. So I took up with the Friday Noon Poets. I joined the North Carolina Poetry Society, and as a charter member joined the brand new North Carolina Writers Network. When I retired as director of the network, there was a great gathering at White Cross School, and I was presented with a scrapbook. It was full of good wishes and wonderful memories, so to prepare for today, I decided to open up that scrapbook and be reminded how the literary community of North Carolina, its writers and its readers, its funders and its audiences, had benefited from Georgianne's motto that she created for the network: writing and reading, everybody's art. We really believed it. That would become our mission. Writing wouldn't be just for a few, it would be for everyone. I'd seen that firsthand, how writing had played a seminal role in my life. Now about some of those teammates. When you open the scrapbook, you see a picture of Marty Silverthorne. Marty's with us here today. And there in front of that lovely old 1928 schoolhouse, he was there in his chair. But what you don't see is that on the back of the building, there was a ramp. As we were reaching out to writers around the state, from the mountains to the sea, we got a letter from a group down east who called themselves Bards of a Feather. It was from Marty, and I was enchanted with their name, and so I called them up. And later, when Marty came on my board, and we had meetings at my house or here in the great room at Weymouth, Marty could get inside, not White Cross School. Well, I don't want to say that badger is quite the right word for Marty, but I can tell you he made it crystal clear he was going to get in that building on his own steam. So I made a pitch to Tom Wisnett and Gary Phillips, who owned the building, and I got in touch with Mary Regan and Nancy Trevelyan and Debbie McGill over at the State Arts Council that we needed a grant. We needed to be ADA accessible, and we got that grant, we built that ramp, and Marty was able to go in. Right, Marty? Marty's one of those teammates, as well as Tom and Gary and Mary and Nancy and Debbie. And let me also throw in Betty Ray McCain and Betsy Buford at the Cultural Resources on our list. And from that time onward, we were always in our venues were always ADA accessible. Nancy Jean Peacock was another teammate, and she came to my house to volunteer. It was before we had funds to get into White Cross. And in the scrapbook she writes, "My volunteer work at the network mostly consisted of sticking stamps and labels on envelopes. Mine went on efficiently but crookedly, while Marcia's went on efficiently and straight and plumb and square, and you could have built a house around the stamps Marcia applied." In the early years, we knew that the key to building membership was through the newsletter and the network news. And in this pages is a column called Submitted that gave the writers valuable publishing opportunities. Nancy was that person who perfected it. I took her off the stamp detail. And in a paid position, she completely organized Submitted by contacting by U.S. snail mail all of the national journals and magazines for updated information. But the network news required funding. So I traipsed over to see Frank Daniels Jr. at the N&O, and he's funded us for 3 years. Then after that, he says, "Marcia, I'm going to turn you over to Rolf Neal." So he sent us down to Charlotte, and Rolf Neal supported us for 3 years. And then Rolf said, "I'm turning you over to Joe Doster at the Winston-Salem Journal." And so for 9 years, we had the newsletter funded. One day, Susan Simone came into the office at White Cross, and she said she wanted to volunteer. Said she didn't want to stuff envelopes and enter names on the database. Little did I know that my resistance to the routine would launch me into a whole new world that I entered in communication with prison writers, men and women writing out of isolated cells in a place where creative achievement is not often a priority. Well, Susan paired up writers and inmates as pen pals. And as it turned out, about that same time, Stephen Barefoot, who was the director of the Paul Green Foundation, decided he wanted to go on to something else. And so he and I cooked up a plan. We convinced our respective boards that we would move the foundation into the network, and I would be its director for 1 day a week. The foundation was much smaller in those days. And now I had the perfect solution. I could use the Paul Green funds to fund our prison work. And so Susan and Dick Craywick and Jackie Shelton Green and many others were teaching the men and women in prisons around the state. And we made all of the inmates, now not just pen pals, we also had programs in English classes, and we had writing workshops. We made them complimentary members. This letter in the retirement scrapbook is from David, a network member, inmate. I remember thinking how at ease you and the writers were you brought, sitting in that room in Central Prison, with a rapist on one side, a murderer on the other. Across the table sat a child molester, a bank robber, and a wife abuser, but you treated us all as human beings, something most of us were not used to. One man who normally spoke less than 4 words without interjecting obscenities never uttered a single 4-letter word in the whole hour you were there. And that's what I call respect. I can report that the foundation continues to support efforts through Hidden Voices in their prison program. We also support Student Action with Farm Workers, which is a theater in the fields annual program in the down east in the fields for migrant workers. And since its founding, the foundation has granted over $500,000 to support numerous arts and human rights projects. So Dick, and Susan, and Jackie, or all others involved in the prison program, are those teammates. I'd also like you to know Deborah Kaufman, who's here today. She was my first president 30 years ago. We were Velcros together by the phone. I imagine we talked 5 or 10 times a day. It was all those uncertain times, and we were just trying to figure it out together. And now for one more teammate, the mate who's been my mate for 59 years, and without whom I couldn't even have been on the team, David Warren. Where are you, Dave? So I've given you a quick glance of what we were up to in those early years when we were building a literary community across this fine state, accessible venues for our programming, supporting the network membership with the newsletter, and gathering up everybody else under the sun we could find to tell them that writing and reading is everybody's art. And it continues to this day under the skill and dedication of network director Ed Southern. Everybody's art operates on the premise that writing can enrich and it can heal. Writing gets done at lofty writers' retreats and at kitchen counters. Sometimes gets stuffed into an apron pocket. Sometimes writing goes on the back of a receipt when you leave the grocery store. And stories can be written on death row, can tell the story of a life that would have ended without being recorded had it not been for those dedicated writer-teachers who protected those stories and brought them to the outside. So I thank you very much for this honor. It's because of you, all of you, that I'm here. And just being remembering that being a champion of literature and literacy has always been a team effort. And I'm just so happy I had the courage to take my sad poems to the Red Baron restaurant in Carrboro, North Carolina.
Well, I gotta tell you, I was feeling pretty good about myself when I was driving down.